Long County Public Safety. How may I help you?
Yes, a person just woke me up that swears that she found her severed head of her son in the basement.
Can I talk to her?
Hello?
Can you tell me what's going on?
Pretty positive my son's head is in a bucket in my basement.
What is your son's name?
Sad Syrian.
When's the last time you saw your son?
He was here a couple hours, then he left with Taylor.
Who's that?
Girl, Taylor.
Where's that?
Go right there. Look right, there's a bucket with a towel on it.
Dude, it is. Hold on, just. That's real, right? That's real, dog. We're gonna need more units here.
When you see butchery like this in murder cases, it does suggest that the individual who perpetrated this violence had some sadistic tendencies or sadistic fantasies that they were able to carry out. This is not a typical murder.
Hi, Taylor. How's it going?
Contact.
Taylor, you have a warrant for your arrest. Just put your hands behind your back. You got blood on your hands here too. No, on your hands.
She's kind of nonchalant. She doesn't seem to be concerned, fearful, suspicious of the police. She's standing there in a relatively calm state. So that's different than most people would be if they're alarmed because they think something bad happened.
Well, a few hours ago, police were dispatched to an address on Stony Brook that the parents of Shad Syrian. You know Shad? And how do you know Shad?
He's my ex.
He's your ex-boyfriend. Well, they found a kind of disturbing stuff at the house there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a lot of blood. Basically Shad's head.
If you're speaking with a police officer and he says, hey, this person you know, they found some disturbing things, and the first thing he says is a lot of blood, I mean, the natural reaction for any person is gonna be, oh my gosh, is he okay? Or something along those lines. So even though the pause before he gets to the even more shocking phrase of severed head, you can see, again, no reaction.
So what we do know about Taylor Shabusiness is that in the past, she has exhibited a number of behaviors and had a number of experiences. First, she has exhibited assaultive behavior towards other students in high school. We know that she's done drugs. We know that she is not free of a behavioral history of being able to be aggressive and hostile and violent. So all those things would be on a differential to try and sort out about what's going on with her and what happened with Shad.
Well, They found part of Shad at his house, his mom's house. Found his head. Where's the rest of his body?
It's there. It's at his house.
Can you tell me what happened?
It's a good question because I blacked out during that time.
What do you think time would be?
I was right there by the bed.
It's by the bed, you think?
Yeah, I was cuddling it by the bed.
What?
I was cuddling it by the bed.
Okay. You start to remember now what happened with Shad? What do you remember so far?
Well, there's this chain thing, right? And then, yeah, like I was playing around with it. And he put it around his neck while we were like playing around and then, I don't know, I was tugging on it and then,
You have any mental health issues we should be aware of?
I don't know yet.
It's curious that when they ask her about her mental health history, she states that she doesn't know yet. Makes me wonder if she's trying to set the stage to be able to avoid or mitigate her responsibility in this crime.
That's very typical of individuals with psychopathy in that they don't want to give too many details early on because they're still trying to figure out how they're going to spin the story.
And so there was a chain.
I think it's on a dresser. It's just weird. I got like a weird flashback.
What did you see?
It was weird. I was riding him like a donkey.
So would this be considered foreplay?
Yeah, it was. And then I just didn't stop. I don't know why. I didn't stop.
Do you use manual strangulation during sex at all? Is Shad like that?
A manual strangulation? Yes.
But does anybody like strangle the other person?
Mainly me. I like doing it a lot. I like doing it to somebody else.
She's framing it right now as we were both into this thing, the strangulation. But as the story goes on, it becomes much more clear that this was an interest that she had prior to that evening. It's something that she's enjoyed before, and it's something she planned on doing. And it's not something particularly that maybe Shad was into. Shad suffered from depression. It might make him more vulnerable to believing that she cared about him, and then he would become more easily manipulated so that she could use him for whatever reason she needed.
Research has shown some correlation between psychopathy and sadistic behavior. She's describing it as if it was a consensual activity. But we know that ultimately she not only murdered him, but then dismembered him in a very vile way. So there's certainly some sadistic behavior that took place at her hands.
Was anybody home? Did you encounter anybody? I understand his mom lives here.
Tara?
Tara?
Is that the mom's name?
Yes.
Damn, the head. Yeah, I can't believe that.
Where'd you do the body?
The body's there.
So we're gonna take the head somewhere?
I like that. I wanted the head.
So you dismembered the body too?
Yeah. They're gonna have fun trying to look for all the organs. But yeah, they're all dismembered.
And what did you do with the body?
Absolutely in the basement. And then, I know I forgot the head. I wanted the head.
Did you bring anything with you?
Yeah, it's in the van. I think it's a foot.
She's almost completely detached from humanity as she's describing it. Even the fact that his mother found his head, the fact that this was someone she had a relationship with, it's her ex-boyfriend. And she's describing his dismembered body parts, again, almost with pride. And I think that the way that she states that is rather chilling and shows that there is truly no remorse and association with his human life.
How did you dismember his body?
Nice.
Where'd you get those from?
Kitchen. My mind wasn't sharp enough.
You weren't sharp?
No. It was alright. Bread knife looks good.
Bread knife?
I was getting pissed off at the dismembering process, actually. Why didn't I have it? I had fun with him for that 2 hours and then boom.
Where would these knives be now?
They're in with all the organs and all the body parts. I took it right next to a pink and black backpack that Shaq gave me. So I left it there.
Her descriptions are really clear. She's identifying items, color, where they are, what kind of knives. So she's now getting very specific, and also making some of the comments, they almost sound like dark humor. She's already throwing in little allusions to what's to come for the police officer.
Before the chain went around his neck, were you and Chad like kissing or any foreplay?
No, we were chilling at home. I was gonna walk him like a dog.
And he wanted that?
I have no idea. But I was gonna do it anyway. I was strangling. I was having fun with that. Oh, I still felt his heartbeat, right?
You did?
I did. So I kept on pulling more and more and more, and I went back in. Almost like he wouldn't die. I was like, dang.
So when did you realize that Chad was not alive anymore?
You know, his face turned purple. He was coughing up bloody. I still didn't stop. I don't know what was going on. And I'm like,
So you wanted him to die?
I didn't want him to die, actually. He's my buddy, but like it happened to him.
Oh, blood's going out of his mouth. What'd you do?
Clean him up a little bit.
Okay.
And then, I just played with him. And I just cuddled him and hugged him.
Shabusiness seems quite interested in control and domination. That's clear from when she even talks about walking him like a dog or riding him like a donkey. By ultimately strangling him until he died, she created a play object for her. We know from the records that she actually engaged in necrophilic acts with his body. She was again in complete control now that she had killed him.
So you realized that by continuing that you may actually kill him.
He was, I swear to God, he was telling me, he's just like, so I'm like, and I did it.
You know, did it make you happy? It was just kind of exciting.
Like, this is the thing that I have, like, I've always had, you know, like, you ever love something so much that you kill it?
Okay.
Like, it happens to me. That's the feeling that I have. I love something so much that I kill it.
Was it sexually exciting to you when you were choking Chad?
Oh, yeah. Very. Boom.
People often wonder, what's the association between sexual arousal, violence? And she words it, do you love something so much you want to kill it? What we do know from a neurophysiologic standpoint, that extreme states of arousal, extreme states of rage have a similar neurochemistry. And so we think that in some people, that's why the two can get paired. Some people can find it emotionally a turn on when there's violence, and when there's violence occurring, it's arousing to them.
Why you knew that you didn't want to call the police or an ambulance?
Actually, I thought about it. And then I was getting angry at myself. Very angry at myself. I didn't have the proper tools. Sucks not having it.
And what do you think should happen if someone does something like this to somebody else?
I don't know. They obviously get prison time.
A 24-year-old woman charged in one of Brown County's most gruesome homicides is found competent to stand trial by a doctor. But the case against Taylor Shabusiness is not moving forward just yet.
Instead, another psychiatric evaluation is being allowed before a judge decides what to do next.
You went off on your attorney, Taylor. You went crazy on your attorney.
You can't do that here.
When she's in the courtroom, she notices cameras. She can play to the camera. She can smirk. She can interact. And so it's almost if I can't put my expert on, I'll go ahead and attack my attorney and show people I'm crazy. I think it's deliberate because she's feigning the confusion, like that's not how the psychiatric illness would manifest itself.
When you were reviewing the phone itself, the extraction of the phone itself on March 2nd of 2022, did you note any searches related to Jeffrey Dahmer?
24 total searches, such things like Jeffrey Dahmer walking into court all sexy.
And did you likewise see any photographs of Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yes, there's a picture of Jeffrey Dahmer on the screen of the cell phone, and she's smiling like they're taking a selfie together.
When we look at her fascination, her obsession with Jeffrey Dahmer, it's almost like a role model for her. Like it's someone she wants to be like or emulate. Jeffrey Dahmer, when he killed people, he liked to dismember them, keep the body parts. He liked to save the heads. And she's emulating that ideal.
You meet a person in school, you say he's your friend, you become friends, you become girlfriend, boyfriend, lovers, gain his trust. An innocent person that's very kind, would do anything for you. And
You figure he's okay? I like to think he is. Somebody heard him, I'll find him who did it. So, if you know somebody that got pissed off at him or something. That's the thing, we're new up here. We honestly haven't met anybody besides my family.
I found a pair of pants. I found like a jacket, a coat, shoes. It stunk really bad. And I swore I seen a bone in there.
Street contacted police after finding burnt clothing, sneakers, and human remains inside a garbage can. The burnt material matches what John Swain had been wearing when he was last seen. Another resident returned home from vacation to find bloodstains on her rug.
What do you know about Theo?
I mean, I've known about him, but I don't know him.
Oh.
Left him up here, she left him. Go home.
Okay. Why'd she leave him?
From what she told me, he said that he was gonna kill her brother, and she left.
We have a missing person from Bismarck, okay? We have some items that were at the apartment that you were staying at. Identified those items as being worn by that missing person.
Okay, so am I being charged with anything, or?
Right now, no.
I mean, I wouldn't be too comfortable talking about this without a lawyer, present.
Here's the deal, Theo. I want you to think about this, okay? This kid has family that is desperately looking for him, that are concerned for him.
Crow communicates a great deal by his body language. We have an individual being interrogated by two detectives who's cool as a cucumber. So that gives us a good window in terms of just how devoid of emotion he is and how unworried he is.
Theo, he got kicked out of my mom's house for living in here.
Okay. Why did he get kicked out of your mom's house?
He hits my sister.
Okay. So you would have started staring at Megan. How was that for you guys?
Bad.
Bad. How was that bad?
Well, I didn't work because I felt like I couldn't trust him with my daughter because he was drinking heavily and he got into drugs. He gets mad really easily.
It seems clear that Donnie is not only afraid of him, but she doesn't trust him with his daughter, and he's hit her sister. This is a very aggressive, violent, versatile criminal who's just doesn't obey the law and doesn't think the rules apply to him.
I'm freaking out, though.
Why are you freaking out?
Because he killed somebody. He said that he pulled a knife on him. And him and his friend.
I mean, you said you had a buddy there.
They said they did together.
Did you say which friend?
He did tell me his name, but I just don't remember. I think it's like a comment, like a Josh or something like that.
Yeah. I just want to let you guys know I'm going to cooperate fully. I was held at gunpoint. He stayed the night at our apartment. Not really sure why. And then he started getting on everybody's nerves. He was being cool with me, but he was starting with my cousin. So we decided, let's walk to the store and get some beers. He said, I'm gonna go see if we can score some weed. So we walked up to this park. We saw this little Asian kid there. Walked up to him, just started with him, just, yeah, you wanna grab some beers, come down to my house and hang out. Kid walked down the street, came into the place, we're just chatting with him. And out of nowhere, the guy that I used to work with just came out and hit the kid in the head with a hammer. He says, hey, check this out. Comes around the corner and just...
So, how many times did he hit him?
I'd say at least 4.
Oh, okay.
I remember one of them, he put the hammer around and the claw and stuck in his head.
They seemingly go out, meet this young boy, 18-year-old John Swain. They lure him back to their house, bashing his head in, and Clark doesn't sound scared or upset. He tells it like he's explaining how he went to the grocery store, which is not what a normal person would do.
On paper, Clark looks a lot cleaner, right? Is very careful in presenting himself as the unwitting witness to Crow's demonic plan. Maybe Clark is just a little bit better at hiding and dissimulating his real intentions and his real acts than Crow is.
I'm like, dude, this is up, man. He pulled out a 10 gauge, or 12, I don't know. Whatever it was, a gun, shotgun, cocked it, put it to my head and said, you can't tell anybody about this. You're gonna help me get rid of this.
What happened to the body, the kid?
He had it in the bathtub. He took a knife and cut him off at the knee joints. He made me help him wrap it up in a blanket and bring it out to his garage.
Where did you get the hammer from?
Somewhere by the door.
Did you have to help him cut him up?
No, I didn't. I don't think he made me cut him up. I mean, I don't know.
You might not remember what you had for breakfast, right? But you're gonna remember cutting up a body. And the fact that he refers to this human being recently deceased as it is further proof of the objectification of the victim. And that's very consistent with the way a psychopath thinks.
A new development in the case of 18-year-old John Swain. Bismarck police say they got a tip that Swain was buried in the backyard of this Montana home where Theo Crow lives with his mother.
All right. We have a search warrant right here for your DNA.
Hey, I guess I'm not sure what you want to talk to me about.
Confession. You know, sir, I've always been the type to, like, you know, take responsibility, you know, for what I've done.
So we spoke with I believe it was a Joshua Clark that said he was there.
Like I said, I don't know where to begin. I mean,
Clark tells us, I'm gonna fully cooperate. Crow says, I'm here to give a confession. Both are vying for control of the interaction with the detectives. They want to get ahead. They want to push their narrative so that they can control the outcome. And that's very psychopathic.
we're pretty drunk. And Josh mentioned that he wanted to kill somebody. And I half believed him, half didn't.
Now, and you guys spoke before about it being a random person?
Yeah. We're just gonna walk, cover down somebody. He suggested a hammer. So we had that with us.
Whose hammer was that?
With Josh's. After we leave my place, we walked towards like the school. There's a playground, a basketball court, and like a soccer field. Right across the way. And we ran into this guy.
What was that guy doing?
He was kicking a soccer ball.
I think that the way they went about selecting their victim is illustrative of some pretty significant psychopathic or antisocial tendencies. They identify A younger individual of smaller stature purposefully choosing somebody who's isolated, it really feels like they view John as almost a pawn in a game that they're playing.
As we're sitting around listening, he's like, Josh, he told me, he said, you signed off. Josh is talking to him. John's sitting on the sofa outdoor.
What happened then?
I'm standing there and I have the hammer in my hand. But it's out of view from them. I turn around and I hit him. At that point, Josh came over and I either handed him or he took the hammer and he started hitting him. I turned away. He hit him 5 to maybe 10 times. You know, just like 10 times, you know what I mean? Like, I knew he was dead. Josh goes in the bathroom to wash off the hammer. John was on the couch and there's blood everywhere.
There's not a whole lot of research about whether psychopaths essentially draw each other, but it makes sense. Imagine if you can find somebody who's like you, who wants to go and do these horrible things and doesn't really feel bad about it. If anything, egging each other on and showing each other this is totally okay to be this way.
He's face down. He's face down in the bathtub. Like Josh comes back and he had more than one, like two or three knives. He hands me one and I cut off his right leg at the knee. Josh cut off the left.
Was that difficult to cut him off?
Yeah, it was. I mean, not difficult as in physically. Like, it was difficult emotionally, is what I'm trying to say.
He catches himself. In the end, again, he feels compelled to say that it was hard emotionally. I think he had to add that just because he heard himself speak, and it sounded horrible.
We wrapped him up. I said, we can put him in my garage. I knew I was gonna put the body in my mom's truck. I was gonna bury the body in my backyard.
Okay. What happened after that then?
We slept. I slept with a knife by the pillow. I remember I told Josh, I said, don't kill me, you know, while I'm sleeping. And he said, don't kill me.
At the end of the day, even when psychopaths may not know what they are, or they may not recognize it entirely in another person, they still know not to trust each other, because this guy will do the exact same thing to me that I'd be thinking about doing to him.
Now, Josh had said that he didn't do anything at the scene, and that it was all you.
I'm not even the one wanting to do it. You know, I mean, he mentioned it, he brought it up. We used, you know, he provided the weapon, I mean, come on.
When people think of psychopaths, they think they have absolutely no emotion, and that's actually not true. Here we see Crow all of a sudden feeling upset because he feels very bad for himself, feels not at all bad for what they did to John Swain.
$59 hours removing the tarp and bagging it up.
So obviously the reason that you're here today is because they went and talked to Theo. There's a lot of things that were different. Okay. Specifically, he said you guys talked about it beforehand.
I mean, I guess. I mean, we were just saying like how mad we were that we could kill somebody. You know, just.
Now's your chance to lay it all out there.
The hammer he used, it was my hammer for work. I ended up burying it underneath the concrete footing, just digging a hole before we poured cement on top of it. I covered it in my hammer.
There's nothing you're leaving out?
No. I told the officers that he threatened me with a shotgun, that he actually pulled it out on me. He didn't pull it out on me. He told me he had a sawed-off 12 gauge. I guess he didn't really threaten me with it. One thing I did leave out when Theo, after he hit him 5 or 6 times, turns to me, holding the hammer out, and says, "You gonna bitch out?" I said, I just took it from him, and I did it once.
Just once?
Just once.
Yeah, just with the hammer.
Yep.
Just about like that.
Just so that he felt that I wasn't gonna narc on him. That's not the kind of person I am. You know, you can obviously tell that by me talking to me. So I mean, I'm not a killer, man. Like, I was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
I think both Crow and Clark had violent and homicidal fantasies that they brought out in each other, and that partnership allowed them to express desires that they had not had the outlet for in the past.
At this time, you are under arrest for participating in that murder.
Why exactly am I being charged, sir?
You took part in this, okay?
I didn't.
Okay, even by your own admission.
The debate is constantly which is the worst psychopath. The Factor 2 type psychopath, which is more antisocial. They're typically more violent and aggressive. Or the Factor 1 psychopath, who tends to maybe blend in more with society, tends to be more manipulative, charming, cunning, which causes more damage. Which is worse? I would say the Factor 1, the type that is more akin to Clark. So I always find the chameleon to be a little more dangerous.
Clark is sentenced to life in prison for his role in the murder of a South Dakota.
The warehouse looked ordinary from the outside. No flashing alarms. No towering fences wrapped in coils of razor wire. No armed guards pacing beneath floodlights. Just a long industrial building standing quietly beneath the wide Canadian sky, surrounded by stretches of farmland that seemed to disappear into the horizon. During the day, trucks rolled in and out with little fanfare. At night, the silence settled so completely that even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb it. Inside that warehouse sat one of the most valuable stockpiles in North America. Not gold. Not diamonds. Not stacks of freshly printed banknotes. Barrels. Thousands upon thousands of steel barrels, each one filled with amber-colored maple syrup harvested from forests across Quebec. At first glance they looked identical, lined up in endless rows like silent soldiers waiting for orders. Their dull metal surfaces reflected the warehouse lights without revealing what they protected inside. Each barrel weighed hundreds of pounds. Each barrel represented thousands of dollars. Together, they represented something even larger than money. They represented control. Control over an industry. Control over prices. Control over supply. Control over a product so deeply woven into Canada's identity that it had become more than food. It was history preserved in liquid form. It was generations of farmers drilling tiny taps into maple trees every spring, waiting patiently for nature to decide whether the season would be generous or cruel. Most people never thought about any of this when they poured maple syrup over pancakes. Few imagined that behind every bottle on a supermarket shelf stood an entire economic system carefully balancing supply and demand. Even fewer imagined that someone was already planning to rob it. Not by smashing windows. Not by pointing guns. Not by threatening lives. But by taking advantage of something far more dangerous than security flaws. Human routine. There is a strange comfort in repetition. A truck arrives. A truck leaves. A barrel is moved. Another barrel replaces it. Workers become familiar with patterns until they stop noticing them. Eyes that once searched carefully begin to glide over details. The unusual slowly becomes invisible simply because it happens often enough. Who would question another truck carrying barrels? Who would stop to count thousands of identical containers every single day? Who would suspect that one of Canada's most tightly controlled agricultural commodities was quietly disappearing, one load at a time? The answer, for months, was no one. The theft did not begin with violence. It began with patience. Someone had studied the system. Someone understood that every fortress has a weakness, and sometimes that weakness is not the wall but the people who believe the wall is enough. Imagine standing inside that warehouse. The air smells faintly sweet despite the cold steel surrounding you. Dust floats lazily through shafts of light falling from windows high above the concrete floor. Rows upon rows of barrels stretch farther than your eyes can comfortably follow. Nothing appears out of place. Nothing demands attention. And yet, somewhere among those thousands of barrels, one is already empty. Another contains only water. Another has disappeared entirely before quietly returning as if nothing ever happened. The deception is almost elegant. No shattered locks. No dramatic escape. No midnight explosions. Just substitution. Replacement. Delay. The kind of crime designed not to shock its victims immediately but to lull them into believing everything is exactly as it should be. It is difficult to fear something you cannot see disappearing. That is exactly what made this operation so extraordinary. Long before investigators would piece together names, vehicles, invoices, and shipping records, there existed only an invisible absence. A missing weight. A missing sweetness. A missing fortune. Some crimes explode into headlines overnight. Others unfold like slow-moving shadows. This one spent months hiding inside plain sight. While families across North America poured maple syrup over breakfasts, while tourists carried bottles home as souvenirs from Canada, while producers prepared for another harvesting season, an underground operation was quietly transforming one of the country's most iconic products into cash. Truck after truck. Barrel after barrel. No urgency. No panic. Only confidence. Confidence built on the belief that the system had become predictable. Confidence built on the assumption that nobody would climb high enough, look closely enough, or ask enough questions before millions of dollars had vanished. History often remembers spectacular robberies because they are loud. Masked men storming banks. Jewels disappearing from museum displays. Armored vehicles ambushed in broad daylight. Those stories satisfy our expectations of crime. This story refuses to. Because the greatest theft in Canadian history looked astonishingly boring while it was happening. There were no ski masks. No dramatic hostage situations. No police helicopters chasing speeding vehicles through city streets. Instead, there were invoices. Storage facilities. Industrial pumps. Metal containers. Ordinary objects carrying an extraordinary secret. Perhaps that is what makes this case so unsettling. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Some of the biggest crimes in history do not hide in darkness. They hide in routine. The people responsible understood something psychologists have discussed for decades. Human attention is limited. The brain constantly filters information it believes is unimportant. If you see the same object every day, eventually you stop truly seeing it. That is why familiar roads blur during a daily commute. That is why workers sometimes forget where they placed tools they have handled for years. And that is why thousands of barrels sitting quietly inside a warehouse became the perfect camouflage. The barrels themselves became invisible. Not because they disappeared. Because everyone assumed they would always be there. Somewhere beyond those warehouse walls, forests stretched across Quebec like endless oceans of green. Every spring, temperatures rose above freezing during the day and dropped below it at night, creating the perfect rhythm for maple sap to flow through ancient trees. For generations, families had depended on those seasons. Their livelihoods relied on patience rather than speed. Nature decided the schedule. Nature decided the harvest. That patience had shaped an entire culture. Ironically, it also created the opportunity for criminals willing to be just as patient. They did not need to steal everything at once. Stealing slowly was safer. Stealing slowly made each missing barrel seem insignificant. Stealing slowly allowed doubt to replace certainty. Was the barrel moved? Was it counted already? Was someone else responsible? Questions delayed action. Delay protected the thieves. By the time anyone realized something was terribly wrong, the operation had already grown into something almost unimaginable. Nearly 10,000 barrels would eventually be linked to the scheme. Millions upon millions of dollars. An agricultural product transformed into one of the largest thefts the country had ever seen. If someone had pitched this story as fiction before it happened, many publishers might have rejected it. A criminal organization stealing maple syrup. Replacing it with water? Returning empty barrels to avoid detection? It sounds almost absurd. Yet reality often possesses a sense of irony that fiction struggles to imitate. Because behind the bizarre headlines waiting in the future lay something deeply familiar. Greed. Opportunity. Confidence. The timeless ingredients behind countless crimes throughout history. Money changes. Targets change. Methods evolve. Human ambition rarely does. And somewhere, before the first investigation began, before detectives gathered evidence, before reporters discovered a headline that would circle the globe, someone made a simple decision. Not to create. Not to harvest. Not to build. But to take. One barrel. Then another. Then another. Until an entire nation's reserve began to quietly disappear without anyone realizing that history was already unfolding inside a silent warehouse. The story of this case cannot begin inside the warehouse alone. To understand why thousands of barrels of maple syrup became the target of one of the largest thefts in Canadian history, we first have to travel far beyond concrete walls and steel containers. We have to step into the forests of Quebec, where every spring begins with a ritual that has remained remarkably unchanged for generations. Winter never releases its grip on Quebec without a fight. Snow lingers beneath the towering maple trees long after the calendar promises warmer days. The forests remain quiet except for the occasional crack of ice shifting beneath the morning sun. Then, almost imperceptibly, the rhythm changes. Daytime temperatures begin to climb above freezing before falling below zero again after sunset. It is this delicate balance between warmth and cold that awakens the trees. Hidden beneath rough grey bark, clear sap begins its slow journey upward. For the families who have harvested maple syrup for decades, there is nothing dramatic about this process. It is simply the arrival of another season. Long before sunrise, trucks pull into sugar bushes. Workers move through rows of trees carrying drills, metal taps, and lengths of tubing. Each hole is carefully placed. Each tap is inserted with practiced hands. There is no rush. Nature decides the pace, and people have learned that impatience accomplishes nothing here. The first drops fall almost silently. They collect inside buckets or travel through intricate networks of plastic tubing that weave through the forest like transparent veins. At this stage, the liquid looks nothing like the rich amber syrup found on breakfast tables. It is nearly clear, carrying only a faint sweetness that hints at what it will eventually become. Creating maple syrup demands extraordinary patience. Dozens of gallons of sap must be boiled for hours before they produce a single gallon of syrup. Steam rises continuously from evaporators, filling sugar shacks with warm clouds carrying an unmistakable aroma. The smell settles into clothing, wooden walls, and memories alike. It is the scent of long workdays, family traditions, and livelihoods passed from one generation to the next. Every bottle represents countless hours of labor. Every harvest depends on weather that no one can control. A spring that arrives too quickly can shorten the season. A prolonged freeze can delay production. Heavy rain, unexpected warmth, or unusual cold can dramatically change the final yield. For producers across Quebec, uncertainty is not an exception. It is part of the profession. That uncertainty gave birth to an unusual solution. Unlike many agricultural industries, maple syrup production became highly organized. Quebec's producers developed a system designed to stabilize prices and protect both farmers and buyers from dramatic swings caused by unpredictable harvests. During productive years, excess syrup could be stored rather than flooding the market. During weaker seasons, those reserves could be released to meet demand. The reserve became something few people outside the industry ever thought about. It was not hidden because it was secret. It was hidden because almost no one realized it existed. To the average customer, maple syrup appeared endlessly available. Grocery shelves remained stocked year after year. Restaurants continued serving pancakes every morning. Tourists purchased decorative glass bottles shaped like maple leaves without considering how carefully the supply behind those shelves was managed. Behind that illusion stood thousands of steel barrels quietly waiting inside storage facilities. Each one contained concentrated months of labor from countless producers scattered across the province. Every barrel represented forests, families, equipment, fuel costs, unpredictable weather, and years of experience. Although the liquid itself seemed simple, its economic value was anything but. By the beginning of the 2010s, Quebec produced the overwhelming majority of the world's maple syrup. That dominance transformed the reserve into something far more significant than a warehouse full of food. It became an economic safeguard whose value reached into international markets. Yet the warehouse itself reflected practicality rather than spectacle. Visitors expecting a high-security vault would have been disappointed. The barrels were stacked in towering rows inside industrial buildings built for storage, not display. Workers relied on inventory records, schedules, forklifts, and routine inspections. Daily operations focused on efficiency. Thousands of containers entered and left according to demand, creating a steady flow that appeared entirely ordinary to anyone familiar with the industry. Routine creates confidence. Confidence creates efficiency. But confidence can also create blind spots. No one wakes up expecting to witness history unfolding during an ordinary workday. People perform the same tasks they completed yesterday because those tasks worked yesterday. Familiar procedures become habits, and habits slowly become assumptions. The warehouse was never designed with the expectation that someone would patiently remove its contents over many months. Most thefts occur quickly. A window breaks. An alarm sounds. Someone runs. This crime belonged to an entirely different category. It depended on understanding systems rather than defeating them. It depended on blending into everyday operations instead of interrupting them. Somewhere, someone recognized that barrels leaving a warehouse did not automatically raise suspicion. Trucks were supposed to transport barrels. Industrial pumps were ordinary equipment. Storage facilities existed throughout the supply chain. Every legitimate part of the industry could also become part of an illegitimate operation if viewed from the right perspective. The plan did not require extraordinary technology. It required extraordinary patience. And patience often proves more dangerous than force. Because patience allows mistakes to remain invisible until they have multiplied beyond imagination. While producers focused on another harvest and consumers continued enjoying maple syrup without a second thought, the conditions for an unprecedented theft were quietly taking shape. Nothing about the forests suggested that history was about to change. Birds continued returning with the spring. Sap continued flowing through maple trees. Families continued boiling it into syrup exactly as their parents and grandparents had done before them. Nature remained honest. People did not. The contrast could not have been sharper. In the forests, every drop required effort before it became valuable. Elsewhere, others had begun asking a different question. Why produce something valuable when it might be easier simply to steal it? That question would eventually grow into an operation so unusual that investigators, journalists, and the public alike struggled to believe it during the early days of the case. Yet before detectives examined evidence or prosecutors prepared charges, the crime existed only as an idea born from observing an industry built on trust, routine, and predictability. Sometimes the strongest lock is not made of steel. Sometimes it is the belief that no one would ever try. And sometimes that belief is exactly what opens the door. For most true crime stories, there is a single victim whose life is forever divided into two chapters, before the crime and after it. A face appears on the screen. Family photographs replace police evidence. Friends struggle to describe a personality that can no longer speak for itself. The maple syrup heist is different. There was no grieving family standing behind yellow police tape. No candlelight vigil. No missing person poster taped to a telephone pole. Yet there were victims. Thousands of them. Scattered across the rolling countryside of Quebec, they lived quiet lives measured not by clocks, but by seasons. Their work began long before sunrise and often ended long after darkness settled over the forests. Their hands carried the marks of years spent drilling taps into maple trees, hauling heavy equipment through melting snow, repairing tubing after winter storms, and tending to an industry built on patience rather than speed. Many of these producers belonged to families who had harvested maple sap for generations. Their grandparents had done the same work. Their parents had done the same work. Children learned early that spring did not simply mean warmer weather. It meant opportunity. It meant uncertainty. It meant another chance to earn a living from trees that asked for nothing more than time. Unlike factories that could increase production by running longer hours, maple syrup producers answered to nature alone. A cold night followed by a warm afternoon could mean an excellent day. Several unusually warm days might end the season before anyone was ready. No amount of determination could force a maple tree to produce sap outside its natural rhythm. That unpredictability shaped an entire community. Every successful harvest carried relief. Every disappointing season carried worry. The strategic reserve existed because of those worries. It was more than a warehouse filled with syrup. It was a promise. A promise that a poor harvest would not destroy years of hard work. A promise that buyers around the world could rely on a stable supply. A promise that producers would not see prices collapse after one unusually productive spring or soar beyond reach after a difficult one. For many farmers, the reserve represented security rather than profit. When they delivered their syrup into the system, they believed it would be protected until the market needed it. Trust formed the invisible foundation beneath every barrel stacked inside those warehouses. Trust is difficult to measure. There are no scales that can weigh it. No invoices that can assign it a dollar value. But once it is broken, everyone feels the loss. Imagine finishing an entire season's work. Weeks of collecting sap. Countless hours feeding evaporators. Long days cleaning equipment. Late nights checking temperatures. Then watching the finished syrup disappear into steel barrels, each sealed and recorded before entering storage. The producer returns home believing the product is safe. Believing the system will do what it was designed to do. Believing tomorrow will look much like today. Those beliefs would eventually become casualties of the crime. Although newspapers around the world focused on the staggering financial loss, many producers viewed the theft differently. Money could be calculated. Trust could not. Every stolen barrel represented someone who had spent weeks transforming clear sap into amber syrup through persistence and experience. The thieves never touched a maple tree. They never stood in freezing forests waiting for the first flow of spring. They never watched steam pouring from sugar shacks while the scent of boiling sap filled the air. Instead, they entered at the final stage. After nature had done its work. After families had done theirs. They stole the result without sharing any part of the journey that created it. That distinction mattered. It transformed the crime from simple theft into something more personal. Not because individual producers knew exactly which barrel had been taken, but because every barrel symbolized effort that could never be recovered. A tree cannot be asked to repeat the same spring twice. Time cannot be harvested again. The maple industry has always relied on cooperation. Independent producers, transport companies, storage facilities, inspectors, distributors, and buyers all participate in a system requiring honesty at every level. Most days, that honesty goes unnoticed. No one celebrates another truck arriving safely. No headlines appear because inventory records match warehouse contents. Routine success rarely attracts attention. Failure always does. Long before investigators arrived, workers inside the reserve trusted what they saw. Rows of identical barrels. Neatly organized aisles. Order. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing suggested that somewhere among thousands of containers, some held only water. Others contained nothing at all. Appearance had become the greatest ally of deception. That realization would later haunt many people connected to the reserve. How long had the theft continued? How many opportunities had existed to notice something unusual? Could anyone have stopped it sooner? Questions like these rarely have satisfying answers. Hindsight creates clarity that never existed in the moment. Looking backward, every missed sign appears obvious. Looking forward, those same signs blend into ordinary life. For the producers themselves, another season continued. Trees flowed. Sap was collected. Children helped parents during weekends. Equipment broke and was repaired. Life refused to pause simply because an invisible crime was unfolding somewhere inside a warehouse. That contrast gives this case much of its emotional weight. The victims did not know they were victims. They continued working while their collective reserve quietly diminished. They celebrated successful harvests while barrels already stood empty. They trusted a system whose greatest vulnerability was not machinery or weather but human calculation. Perhaps that is why this story resonates far beyond the maple industry. Every society depends upon invisible systems held together by confidence. Banks function because people trust deposits will remain there. Supply chains function because records are accurate. Businesses function because contracts mean something. The strategic maple syrup reserve functioned because thousands of people believed every barrel would remain exactly where it belonged until it was legitimately needed. That belief was worth millions. The thieves understood its value before anyone else did. They realized they were not merely stealing syrup. They were stealing time before discovery. They were stealing confidence from an entire industry. And every day that passed without detection increased both the financial loss and the eventual shock that would ripple across Canada once the truth finally emerged. When history remembers the maple syrup heist, headlines naturally focus on numbers. Millions of dollars. Thousands of barrels. Hundreds of truckloads. Yet beneath every statistic stood real people whose work filled those barrels one spring day at a time. Their names rarely appeared in newspapers. Their photographs rarely appeared in documentaries. But without them, there would have been nothing worth stealing. They were the silent victims of a crime unlike any Canada had seen before. Every extraordinary crime begins with an ordinary decision. Not the decision to steal. That comes later. The first decision is much quieter. It is the moment someone looks at a system that everyone else accepts and asks a different question. Instead of wondering how the system works, they wonder how it can be manipulated. Somewhere during 2011, that question became the foundation of an operation unlike anything Canadian investigators had encountered before. The warehouse was alive with movement during business hours. Forklifts navigated narrow aisles between towering stacks of steel barrels. Truck drivers arrived according to schedules that rarely changed. Paperwork moved from one desk to another. Inventory records were updated. Deliveries came and went with little drama because that was exactly how a successful storage facility was supposed to function. Nothing about the daily routine suggested that a crime was already underway. The people responsible did not arrive wearing masks. They did not cut through fences under the cover of darkness. They did not force open heavy vault doors. Instead, they blended into an environment built upon repetition. That made them difficult to notice. Industrial warehouses are designed for efficiency. Every hour, equipment moves valuable goods from one location to another. Workers expect motion. Trucks are expected to leave carrying cargo. A barrel being loaded onto a trailer is not unusual. It is part of the job. The thieves understood this better than anyone. Rather than fighting the system, they allowed the system to work for them. Barrels containing maple syrup were quietly transported away from the reserve. Their destination was not another authorized warehouse but a remote facility where the real work would begin. There was nothing glamorous about that location. No hidden underground laboratory. No sophisticated criminal headquarters. Just an isolated building where powerful pumps, hoses, storage tanks, and ordinary industrial equipment could transform stolen property into anonymous inventory ready for sale. One barrel at a time, the syrup was removed. The thick amber liquid flowed through hoses into other containers while empty steel barrels waited nearby. At first, the thieves exercised remarkable caution. They knew that an empty barrel would immediately attract attention if anyone attempted to move it. Weight mattered. Every full barrel weighed hundreds of pounds. Workers who handled them every day instinctively understood how much resistance should greet them when they pushed, lifted, or repositioned one. So the criminals devised a simple solution. After removing the syrup, they filled many of the barrels with water. The replacement was not intended to fool laboratory testing. It only needed to fool routine observation. From a distance, every barrel looked identical. With water inside, many felt heavy enough that no one would suspect their valuable contents had disappeared. The deception relied on psychology rather than chemistry. No one expected maple syrup to become water. Therefore, no one looked for it. Once refilled, the barrels were transported back to the reserve. They returned to their places among thousands of identical containers as though they had never left. The illusion remained intact. Rows stayed full. Inventory appeared complete. Nothing looked stolen. The operation continued. Weeks became months. Confidence slowly replaced caution. Every successful trip encouraged another. Every unnoticed substitution reinforced the belief that the system could be exploited indefinitely. Success has a dangerous side effect. It convinces intelligent people that they are invincible. As time passed, the thieves became increasingly bold. Replacing syrup with water required time and effort. Pumps had to be connected. Barrels had to be resealed. Transportation schedules had to be carefully coordinated. Eventually, some barrels were no longer refilled at all. They were simply returned empty. It was a remarkable gamble. Yet the gamble worked. No immediate alarm followed. No emergency inventory inspection uncovered the deception. Thousands of barrels standing shoulder to shoulder created their own camouflage. One empty container disappeared within a sea of full ones. Then another. Then another. The theft expanded into something almost unimaginable. Truck after truck carried away syrup worth thousands of dollars. The stolen product entered legitimate commercial channels where buyers often had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Maple syrup changes hands many times between producer and consumer. Wholesalers, distributors, processors, exporters, and retailers all participate in that chain. Once removed from the reserve, the syrup itself carried no visible sign of its origin. Its appearance remained exactly the same. Its taste remained exactly the same. Its value remained exactly the same. Only its ownership had changed. That made tracing individual shipments extraordinarily difficult. Unlike artwork or rare jewelry, maple syrup cannot be identified by unique visual characteristics. One barrel closely resembles another. Once transferred into new containers, distinguishing stolen syrup from legitimate inventory becomes nearly impossible without supporting documentation. The criminals relied upon this reality. Documentation can be altered. Appearances rarely reveal the truth. Meanwhile, Life inside the reserve continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Employees performed inspections. Deliveries arrived. Schedules remained unchanged. The warehouse itself became an unwilling participant in its own deception. Every untouched stack of barrels reassured workers that everything was exactly where it belonged. The thieves were stealing not only syrup but certainty. Each successful trip widened the gap between reality and perception. Reality said millions of dollars were disappearing. Perception said everything looked perfectly normal. This disconnect lies at the heart of many sophisticated financial crimes, corporate frauds, and organized thefts. People trust systems because systems usually deserve that trust. When those systems function smoothly day after day, questioning them begins to feel unnecessary. That false sense of security became one of the operation's greatest assets. No dramatic confrontation interrupted the theft. No witness suddenly discovered criminals in the act. No frantic escape unfolded beneath flashing police lights. Instead, the operation advanced with remarkable patience. Every load represented another calculated risk. Every successful return increased confidence. Every ordinary day without discovery encouraged the next shipment. From the outside, Canada continued celebrating one of its most recognizable products. Restaurants served pancakes drenched in maple syrup. Gift shops displayed decorative bottles for tourists. Export shipments left the province for customers around the world. Nothing suggested that one of the country's most valuable agricultural reserves was quietly shrinking from within. History often remembers the day a crime is discovered. Far fewer people remember the months during which it was allowed to grow unnoticed. Those hidden months are where this story truly became extraordinary. Not because of violence. Not because of spectacular action. But because deception proved stronger than force. The criminals had discovered something that many investigators would later acknowledge with reluctant admiration. Sometimes the easiest place to hide something is exactly where everyone expects to find it. Sometimes the safest disguise is normality itself. And sometimes the most astonishing crime scenes look completely ordinary until someone notices that one impossible detail, a barrel that should weigh hundreds of pounds, suddenly feels almost weightless. That moment had not arrived yet. For now, the warehouse remained silent. The rows of steel barrels stood undisturbed beneath industrial lights. And somewhere among them, millions of dollars had already vanished without leaving behind a single broken lock. By the summer of 2012, the theft had already lasted far longer than anyone inside the maple syrup reserve could have imagined. From the outside, nothing had changed. The warehouse still stood beneath the broad Quebec sky, its walls shielding thousands of steel barrels arranged in seemingly perfect order. Forklifts continued to move through narrow aisles. Trucks arrived according to schedule. Paperwork was completed with the same quiet efficiency that had defined the operation for years. Routine remained intact. Routine always feels convincing. It whispers that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. That nothing unusual is waiting around the next corner. But hidden beneath that comforting rhythm was a simple fact no one had yet uncovered. Some of those barrels no longer contained maple syrup. Some contained water. Others contained almost nothing at all. The discovery did not begin with a dramatic police raid or an anonymous tip. It began with a routine inventory. Every organized storage system depends on periodic verification. Records must match reality. Numbers written on paper must correspond to physical objects sitting inside the warehouse. It is tedious work. Repetitive work. The kind of task that rarely attracts attention because, most of the time, everything adds up exactly as expected. That summer, one employee carried out those ordinary responsibilities. Michel Gauvry was performing an inventory inspection, moving through rows of barrels that appeared no different from the countless others he had seen before. There was no reason to expect that this day would become one of the most significant moments in the history of the Canadian maple syrup industry. He climbed onto a stack of barrels to continue his inspection. From above, the warehouse stretched outward in orderly lines of steel containers. Everything looked exactly as it should. Appearances, however, can be remarkably deceptive. At one point, Govri reached toward a barrel, expecting the familiar resistance that came with moving a container weighing hundreds of pounds. Instead, something impossible happened. The barrel moved far too easily. His body reacted before his mind could fully understand what had occurred. Expecting substantial weight, he nearly lost his balance when the barrel failed to resist with anything close to its normal mass. For a brief moment, confusion replaced certainty. A barrel that should have weighed roughly 600 pounds behaved almost as though it were empty. That single unexpected movement shattered months of illusion. It is often said that investigations begin with a clue. Sometimes that clue is microscopic DNA. Sometimes it is a fingerprint. Sometimes it is a surveillance recording. In this case, it was weight. Or rather, the complete absence of it. What initially appeared to be a simple irregularity quickly demanded closer examination. Workers began checking additional barrels. Some contained water instead of syrup. Others held little or nothing at all. The discovery spread through the warehouse with growing disbelief. Each new inspection confirmed what no one wanted to believe. This was not a bookkeeping error. This was not a misplaced shipment. This was theft. And not the ordinary kind. No smashed locks suggested forced entry. No broken windows pointed toward a nighttime burglary. No obvious signs of intrusion explained how such an enormous quantity of maple syrup had disappeared. Instead, the warehouse itself appeared almost untouched. That contradiction transformed confusion into alarm. How could millions of dollars vanish without leaving behind visible destruction? Questions multiplied faster than answers. How many barrels had been affected? When had the theft begun? Who had access? How had nobody noticed sooner? The inventory process shifted almost immediately from routine administration to emergency verification. Workers moved from barrel to barrel, checking contents that only hours earlier they had assumed were exactly what the labels claimed. Each confirmed discrepancy deepened the scale of the crisis. This was no isolated incident. The numbers continued climbing. Hundreds of barrels. Then thousands. Eventually, investigators would determine that approximately 9,571 barrels had been emptied or otherwise compromised during the operation. The financial implications were staggering. The emotional impact inside the industry proved equally profound. People who had trusted the reserve now confronted an uncomfortable reality. The theft had succeeded not because security had been violently overwhelmed, but because confidence itself had been exploited. Authorities were notified without delay. Soon, the warehouse that had quietly stored maple syrup became the focus of a criminal investigation unlike any other in Canada. Police officers entered an environment unlike a conventional crime scene. There was no overturned furniture. No shattered glass. No obvious trail leading toward fleeing suspects. Instead, evidence hid within inventory records, transportation schedules, shipping documents, barrel locations, and subtle inconsistencies that had accumulated over many months. Investigators understood immediately that this would not be a case solved by following footprints through mud. The crime had unfolded gradually. Its evidence would have to be reconstructed just as gradually. Standing inside the warehouse, detectives faced an almost overwhelming challenge. Thousands upon thousands of nearly identical barrels surrounded them. Some were untouched. Some had been emptied. Some had been filled with water. From a distance, there was no meaningful difference. The crime scene looked almost perfectly organized. That was perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. The criminals had not left chaos behind. They had left order. False order. Every carefully stacked barrel now carried uncertainty. Every inventory sheet became a document requiring renewed scrutiny. Every shipment entering or leaving the reserve during previous months suddenly acquired investigative significance. The realization spread quickly through officials connected to the maple syrup reserve. This was not merely a theft measured in dollars. It threatened confidence in the entire storage system. If thousands of barrels could quietly disappear without immediate detection, difficult questions would inevitably follow. How secure was the reserve? Had similar thefts occurred before? Could buyers continue trusting the integrity of the inventory? Those concerns extended beyond Quebec. The province supplied most of the world's maple syrup. International customers depended upon consistent deliveries. The reserve represented stability in a market shaped by unpredictable harvests. Its credibility mattered far beyond Canada's borders. News of the discovery soon began attracting attention. At first, the story sounded almost unbelievable. Millions of dollars worth of maple syrup stolen. Many people assumed the reports must be exaggerated. The object of the theft seemed almost comical compared with gold bullion or priceless artwork. Yet investigators knew better. The value was entirely real. So was the sophistication of the operation. Every newly examined barrel reinforced that conclusion. This had required planning, transportation, storage, equipment, patience. Above all, it required confidence that routine inspections would not expose the deception too soon. For months, that confidence had been justified. Now it was collapsing. Inside the warehouse, what had once appeared reassuringly ordinary became deeply suspicious. The familiar rows of barrels no longer symbolized security. They symbolized uncertainty. Each untouched stack reminded investigators how effectively appearances could conceal reality. The discovery itself offered no immediate suspects. No confession appeared. No eyewitness stepped forward claiming to have watched barrels disappear. The warehouse answered one question while creating dozens more. Yes, an enormous theft had occurred. But who had orchestrated it? How had the syrup been moved? Where had it gone? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all remained unanswered. If one employee had not noticed that impossibly light barrel during an ordinary inventory inspection, how much longer would the operation have continued unnoticed? That question lingered over every stage of the investigation. Because history sometimes changes not through elaborate detective work or remarkable technology, but because one experienced worker notices that something feels just a little lighter than it should. The discovery of the missing syrup answered only one question. A crime had taken place. Everything else remained buried beneath months of carefully orchestrated deception. For investigators, the warehouse was no longer simply a storage facility. It had become a puzzle containing thousands of nearly identical pieces, most of which offered no obvious clues. There were no shattered locks to examine. No surveillance footage showing masked intruders. No abandoned vehicle sitting outside the building waiting to reveal its owner. Instead, detectives faced something far more difficult. A crime that had blended perfectly into ordinary business operations. Every investigation begins by asking the same simple question. Who had the opportunity? Inside the maple syrup reserve, that question immediately widened the field of possibilities. Employees had legitimate access. Truck drivers entered and left on scheduled deliveries. Contractors occasionally worked around the facilities. Warehouse procedures depended upon trust, paperwork, and routine verification rather than constant armed supervision. None of those facts proved guilt. But each represented a path investigators could not ignore. Records were gathered. Shipping manifests were examined. Inventory logs were compared against transportation schedules stretching back months. Detectives searched for inconsistencies that might reveal when the theft had begun. The deeper they looked, the more astonishing the scale appeared. This was not the work of an impulsive thief acting alone. Thousands of barrels could not disappear through coincidence. The operation required planning, transportation, storage, equipment, people. That realization fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Police were no longer searching for someone who had committed a theft. They were searching for an organized network. The warehouse itself provided surprisingly little physical evidence. The criminals had not needed to force their way inside. Because the barrels had eventually been returned, at least during the earlier stages of the operation, the scene lacked many of the traces investigators typically rely upon. Instead, detectives followed paperwork. Financial crimes often leave paper trails even when physical evidence remains scarce. Every legitimate shipment generates records. Invoices. Delivery schedules. Purchase agreements. Fuel receipts. Warehouse documentation. Somewhere among those ordinary business documents, investigators hoped the extraordinary would begin to reveal itself. At the same time, another important question emerged. Where had thousands of barrels of maple syrup gone? Unlike stolen jewelry that can disappear into private collections, maple syrup is a commercial product designed to be sold. Eventually, someone must buy it. That reality offered investigators their first meaningful advantage. The syrup itself could not remain hidden forever. Soon, detectives began examining commercial distribution networks extending beyond Quebec. Maple syrup regularly crossed provincial borders before reaching retailers, processors, exporters, and wholesalers. Large volumes moving through unfamiliar channels naturally attracted attention once investigators knew where to look. As information accumulated, shipments connected to businesses outside Quebec became increasingly significant. Some syrup appeared to have reached distributors in New Brunswick. Other quantities traveled toward businesses in Vermont, just across the border in the United States. Those discoveries did not immediately identify criminals. Many purchasers had no reason to suspect the syrup's origin. From their perspective, they were participating in legitimate commercial transactions. That complicated the investigation. Not every person connected to the stolen syrup had knowingly handled stolen property. Separating innocent buyers from deliberate participants demanded patience. Detectives interviewed business owners, transportation companies, warehouse operators, drivers, industry representatives. Every conversation added another fragment to an increasingly complicated picture. Some interviews produced useful information. Others ended in frustration. Memory is imperfect. Months had already passed. Routine deliveries blur together over time. One truck resembles another. One shipment resembles the next. People remembered little because nothing had seemed unusual when the deliveries occurred. That normality had protected the thieves. It now slowed investigators. As evidence slowly accumulated, detectives recognized another characteristic of the operation. The stolen syrup had not been sold all at once. Instead, it appeared to have been divided into smaller quantities before entering legitimate markets. The strategy was remarkably effective. Selling an enormous shipment immediately might have raised suspicion. Selling smaller loads through multiple channels allowed the product to disappear gradually into ordinary commerce. The criminals understood markets. They understood perception. Most importantly, they understood patience. Every careful decision delayed discovery. Meanwhile, public interest in the case continued growing. The idea that millions of dollars in maple syrup had vanished captured international attention almost immediately. Many headlines emphasized the unusual nature of the crime. For investigators, however, there was nothing amusing about it. Behind the unusual target stood an organized criminal operation involving millions of dollars and months of deliberate planning. Detectives resisted the temptation to focus solely on the bizarre headline. Instead, they treated the case exactly as they would any major organized theft. Money, transportation, relationships, communication. Every criminal network leaves patterns behind. The challenge lies in recognizing those patterns before they disappear. Several theories circulated during the early stages of the investigation. Could organized crime groups be involved? Had insiders provided critical information? Did multiple independent thefts somehow overlap? Were inventory weaknesses alone sufficient to explain the operation? Each possibility demanded attention. Each possibility consumed valuable investigative resources. Many ultimately led nowhere. Dead ends are rarely remembered by history. Yet they occupy much of every real investigation. Hours become days. Days become weeks. Officers pursue promising leads only to discover ordinary business activity. Financial records appear suspicious before ultimately proving legitimate. Witnesses recall details that later collapse under closer examination. Progress rarely follows a straight line. This case proved no different. Still, investigators refused to abandon the evidence. Every transportation record, every purchase, every warehouse, every business connected to unusually large quantities of maple syrup became part of a growing investigative map. Slowly, isolated facts began connecting. A shipment here. A storage location there. Names appearing more than once. Vehicles linked across multiple transactions. None of those individual discoveries solved the case. Together, they suggested something much larger. The theft had not been improvised. It had been managed. Someone coordinated transportation. Someone arranged buyers. Someone understood how to move enormous quantities of syrup without immediately attracting attention. The image of a lone thief quietly stealing barrels dissolved completely. What remained was the outline of an organized conspiracy. For detectives, that realization brought both encouragement and pressure. Organized operations inevitably involve more people. More people create more opportunities for mistakes. Someone eventually talks. Someone forgets. Someone keeps a document that should have been destroyed. Someone appears in the wrong place at the wrong time. Large conspiracies rarely remain perfect forever. The investigators simply needed enough patience to outlast the criminals. Ironically, patience had made the theft possible. Now patience would become law enforcement's greatest weapon. The warehouse where the crime first came to light gradually faded into the background. The investigation spread across provinces and crossed international borders through commercial records rather than dramatic police pursuits. The real crime scene had never been limited to one building. It extended through transportation routes, processing facilities, financial transactions, and business relationships connecting hundreds of miles of ordinary commerce. Somewhere within that expanding network stood the people responsible. Investigators could not yet see them clearly. But for the first time since the impossibly light barrel revealed the theft, they had begun following a trail that pointed not merely toward missing syrup, but toward the minds that believed they had designed the perfect crime. Every major investigation eventually reaches a point where scattered fragments begin to align. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But in a way that only becomes visible in hindsight. For months, investigators had been collecting pieces of a puzzle they could not yet see. Shipping records, commercial transactions, interviews with distributors, and warehouse logs formed a dense web of information. Individually, none of it was conclusive. Together, it hinted at something structured, deliberate, and surprisingly disciplined. Then a pattern began to emerge. Certain shipments appeared repeatedly across different records. Certain names reappeared in connection with unusual volumes of maple syrup. Certain transportation routes linked facilities that, on the surface, had no obvious reason to be connected. At first, these overlaps were dismissed as coincidence. In large commercial industries, repetition is normal. Businesses trade with the same partners. Trucks follow familiar routes. Warehouses handle recurring clients. Nothing about repetition alone suggests criminal activity. But investigators had learned to look for repetition that did not belong. Not repetition that made sense. Repetition that persisted without clear justification. Slowly, that distinction began to matter. As analysts worked through financial documents, they noticed that some transactions did not match the typical behavior of legitimate syrup distribution. Quantities were unusually large. Payment structures sometimes appeared inconsistent with standard industry practices. Certain buyers seemed to receive product under conditions that warranted closer scrutiny. Each observation, taken alone, could be explained. Together, they began to form a direction. A direction always matters more than a detail. It suggested that the stolen syrup was not disappearing into chaos. It was being guided. That realization shifted the entire tone of the investigation. This was no longer about missing inventory. It was about organization. And organization requires leadership. Detectives began focusing less on individual shipments and more on relationships between people and companies. Who was connected to whom? Who coordinated deliveries? Who benefited from irregular supply flows? Who had the ability to influence movement of large quantities of product without attracting immediate suspicion? That shift proved decisive. Because once investigators stopped looking at the syrup and started looking at the structure around it, patterns that had previously been invisible began to surface. One name began appearing more frequently than others. Not always directly. Sometimes through business associations. Sometimes through indirect references in shipping arrangements. Sometimes through logistical links that required deeper interpretation of records. But the repetition was there. Quiet. Persistent. Uncomfortable. Investigators followed that thread carefully, aware that early conclusions in complex financial crimes can be misleading. They verified connections. Rechecked documents. Cross-referenced statements from multiple sources. Every step required patience because rushing meant risking misinterpretation. Gradually, the outline of a central figure began to take shape. Someone with access. Someone with knowledge of the industry. Someone capable of coordinating movement across multiple facilities. Someone who understood both the physical logistics of handling syrup barrels and the commercial pathways needed to sell large quantities without immediate detection. That combination of knowledge was rare and valuable. As the investigation deepened, surveillance and financial analysis began working in parallel. Authorities monitored communications, tracked movements, and examined relationships between individuals suspected of involvement. Nothing was assumed. Everything required confirmation. Then came the critical convergence. Multiple strands of evidence began pointing toward coordinated activity rather than isolated transactions. Meetings between key individuals. Overlapping involvement in transportation and storage. Financial flows that aligned suspiciously well with the timing of missing inventory. What had once been speculation began to solidify into a working theory. A coordinated network had stolen syrup from the reserve, processed it through unauthorized facilities, and distributed it through commercial channels under the appearance of legitimate trade. At the center of that network, investigators believed, stood a single coordinating figure. That belief changed the urgency of the case. Because identifying a structure is one thing. Identifying leadership is another. Leadership can be disrupted. Leadership can be isolated. Leadership can be prosecuted. The challenge was proving it. Investigators needed more than patterns. They needed direct evidence linking individuals to the physical movement of stolen syrup. That meant surveillance intensified. Transactions were traced in greater detail. Connections between warehouses, transportation companies, and buyers were mapped with increasing precision. Every piece of new information either strengthened or weakened the emerging theory. And slowly, the theory strengthened. A breakthrough rarely arrives as a single moment of revelation. It arrives as confirmation after confirmation until doubt becomes harder to maintain than belief. That is what began to happen. Eventually, investigators were able to establish enough evidence to justify targeted enforcement actions. Searches were conducted. Records were seized. Individuals connected to the operation were questioned under formal investigation procedures. What emerged from those actions confirmed what had been suspected. The operation had not been random. It had been organized with deliberate structure. There were roles. There were processes. There was coordination across multiple points in the supply chain. And there was a central figure directing key aspects of the operation. That individual, identified by investigators as Richard Villiers, became the focal point of the case. Evidence suggested he had played a leading role in orchestrating the removal, storage, and distribution of stolen maple syrup. His involvement connected multiple layers of the operation, linking physical handling of barrels with commercial transactions and distribution networks. With that identification, the investigation reached its defining turning point. What had once been an unexplained disappearance of inventory was now a structured criminal enterprise with a discernible hierarchy. The scale of the operation became clearer with every additional discovery. Thousands of barrels had been systematically removed over an extended period. The syrup had been converted into liquid assets through carefully managed distribution channels. The illusion of normal inventory movement had masked the theft long enough for it to grow into one of the largest in Canadian history. Yet even as the network was exposed, investigators remained careful. Accusations required proof. Patterns required validation. Suspicion alone could not sustain prosecution. But the accumulation of evidence had reached a threshold where denial was no longer plausible. The breakthrough did not come from a single dramatic confession or sudden revelation. It came from persistence. From connecting data points that initially appeared unrelated. From refusing to dismiss inconsistencies as coincidence. From treating every small irregularity as potentially meaningful. By the time the investigative structure fully crystallized, the story of the theft had fundamentally changed. It was no longer about missing barrels in a warehouse. It was about a coordinated system designed to exploit trust, routine, and the predictability of industrial operations. And at the center of that system, investigators now had a name, a structure, and a case strong enough to move toward prosecution. The silence of the warehouse had finally been replaced by something far more consequential. Evidence that could speak in court. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the story had already traveled far beyond the quiet warehouse where it began. It had become a national reference point, a symbol of how something as ordinary as maple syrup could sit at the center of one of the most unusual large-scale thefts in Canadian history. But inside the courtroom, none of that mattered. Headlines faded. Public fascination quieted. What remained was evidence, testimony, and the slow, deliberate process of turning suspicion into legal truth. The atmosphere was markedly different from the industrial silence of the warehouse or the tense uncertainty of the investigation phase. Here, everything was structured, formal, and carefully contained. Every word spoken carried weight. Every document submitted had to withstand scrutiny. Every claim required proof that could survive challenge from the defense. At the center of it all stood Richard Villiers, identified by investigators as the key figure in orchestrating the operation that had drained thousands of barrels of maple syrup from Quebec's strategic reserve. His presence in court represented the culmination of years of investigation, countless hours of analysis, and a network of evidence that had been pieced together from logistics records, financial transactions, and witness testimony. The prosecution's case did not rely on a single dramatic moment. Instead, it was built like the investigation itself had been built, layer upon layer. First came the evidence of missing inventory, then the confirmation of irregular shipments, followed by the commercial pathways that carried the stolen syrup into distribution channels. Each layer reinforced the next, creating a structure that became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Witnesses described the systems that governed the reserve, explaining how barrels were tracked, how inventory was recorded, and how routine operations were expected to function without disruption. Against this backdrop, the discrepancies stood out with increasing clarity. Barrels that should have been accounted for were not. Records that should have aligned did not. Movements that should have been transparent appeared instead fragmented and inconsistent. Financial experts testified about the value of the stolen syrup, translating thousands of barrels into monetary terms that underscored the scale of the loss. What might have sounded almost surreal at first, a theft of maple syrup, became undeniably serious when expressed in economic impact. Millions of dollars had effectively vanished through a system that was never designed to anticipate internal manipulation on such a scale. The defense, as expected, challenged the interpretation of the evidence. They questioned the assumptions drawn from patterns. They examined the reliability of records. They attempted to introduce doubt into the narrative constructed by investigators over months of work. In complex financial crimes, ambiguity is often the strongest tool available to the defense, because large systems rarely produce perfect clarity. But the prosecution's strength lay not in perfection, but in accumulation. No single piece of evidence needed to be absolute on its own. It was the convergence of many independent findings that created the weight of the case. Shipping documents aligned with warehouse records. Transportation logs matched financial flows. Testimonies from industry participants supported the timeline constructed by investigators. Each element reinforced the others in a way that became increasingly difficult to separate. As proceedings continued, the court was presented with a picture of deliberate coordination rather than isolated incidents. The theft was not portrayed as opportunistic or spontaneous. It was systematic. It relied on understanding how a legitimate supply chain functioned and then inserting manipulation into its most routine operations. That routine had once been its protection. In court, it became part of its vulnerability. The figure at the center of the case remained composed throughout much of the proceedings, a detail noted by observers but interpreted differently depending on perspective. To some, it suggested control. To others, detachment. In courtroom settings, outward expression rarely reveals internal reality with certainty, and the legal process is designed to focus on facts rather than interpretation of demeanor. When the verdict was ultimately delivered, it reflected the weight of the assembled evidence. The court concluded that the operation had been real, coordinated, and extensive in scope. The charges related to the theft and handling of stolen property were upheld. Richard Villiers was sentenced to a term of imprisonment, and financial penalties were imposed that reflected the scale of the losses involved, amounting to millions in Canadian dollars. The sentencing marked the formal closure of the judicial phase, but not the end of the story's impact. In the aftermath, discussions within the industry shifted toward prevention. How could a system designed for stability be strengthened against internal exploitation? What safeguards could be added without disrupting efficiency? How could trust be preserved while reducing vulnerability? Security measures within the reserve were significantly enhanced. Monitoring systems were upgraded. Inventory tracking became more rigorous. Auditing processes were strengthened to ensure that discrepancies would be detected more quickly in the future. The goal was not only to prevent repetition of the same type of crime, but to restore confidence in a system that had been shaken by its success. Yet even with legal resolution and institutional reform, the case retained a certain unease. It challenged assumptions about what kinds of crimes attract attention and what kinds can remain hidden in plain sight for extended periods. It demonstrated that complexity is not always the strongest defense against detection, but routine can be just as powerful a shield when combined with trust. Inside the courtroom, the story reached its official conclusion. Outside, its implications continued to spread. For many, the idea that one of the largest thefts in Canadian history involved something as unassuming as maple syrup remained difficult to fully reconcile. But for those who studied the case closely, the lesson was not about the unusual target. It was about the systems that made such a theft possible in the first place. And in that sense, the courtroom did not just deliver a verdict on a crime. It delivered a reminder that even the most familiar structures can contain vulnerabilities waiting quietly beneath their surface, unnoticed until the moment they are no longer invisible. When the maple syrup heist first broke into public awareness, it was often described in headlines as unusual, almost absurd, as if the subject matter itself made the crime lighter than it truly was. Maple syrup did not carry the same psychological weight as gold, art, or human tragedy. It was something associated with breakfast tables, childhood memories, and national identity. That perception made the scale of the crime harder for many people to fully grasp at first. But time has a way of stripping away novelty. What remains is structure. And what remains in this case is not the strangeness of the target, but the precision of the system that was exploited. Looking back, the most unsettling aspect of the entire operation is not that thousands of barrels were stolen, but that they were stolen inside a framework built entirely on trust and repetition. The reserve was never designed to fail in a dramatic way. It was designed to function quietly, efficiently, and predictably. That predictability became its greatest vulnerability. Every system that relies on routine carries a hidden assumption that the people inside the system will behave consistently, that records will reflect reality, That movement of goods will be honest unless proven otherwise. In most cases, that assumption is correct. Without it, large-scale industry would collapse under the weight of constant suspicion. The maple syrup heist exposed the tension inside that assumption. Too much trust creates blind spots. Too little trust destroys functionality. The balance between the two is fragile, and this case forced an entire industry to reconsider where that balance should sit. In the years following the conviction and sentencing, changes were not immediate, but they were steady. Systems that had once relied heavily on manual oversight began integrating more rigorous tracking methods. Inventory verification became more frequent. Oversight expanded. The goal was not to transform the industry into a fortress, but to ensure that visibility improved without disrupting the rhythm of production. Yet even with improved safeguards, the memory of what happened remained embedded in the industry's identity. For producers, the story carried a different emotional weight than it did for the public. For them, it was not an unusual headline. It was a disruption of something deeply personal. Each barrel represented labor that could not be recovered. Each missing shipment represented time that had already passed through seasons that could not be replayed. There is a particular kind of loss that cannot be measured purely in financial terms. It is the loss of certainty. The belief that when work is completed, its result will remain secure. The maple syrup heist fractured that belief, not permanently, but significantly enough that it reshaped how people thought about protection, ownership, and oversight within the industry. For investigators, the case became a reference point. Not because it was violent or technologically complex, but because it demonstrated how vulnerability often hides in simplicity. There was no need for sophisticated hacking systems or dramatic infiltration tactics. The operation succeeded because it blended seamlessly into normal operations. It moved at the same speed as legitimate business. It used the same infrastructure. It relied on the same expectations. That is what made it so difficult to detect. And that is what makes it so instructive in hindsight. Crimes like this rarely announce themselves. They accumulate. Slowly. Quietly. In ways that appear insignificant until the total becomes impossible to ignore. By the time the theft was fully understood, the system had already absorbed its impact. Thousands of barrels had been removed, processed, redistributed, and absorbed into commercial channels. Some of it reached consumers who never knew its origin. Some of it passed through intermediaries who had no reason to suspect anything unusual. The ripple effect of the operation extended far beyond the warehouse where it began. And yet, in the aftermath, there was no sense of cinematic resolution. No dramatic final confrontation that erased what had happened. Instead, there was investigation, prosecution, sentencing, and gradual adjustment. The kind of closure that exists in institutional systems rather than emotional ones. The forest, of course, continued to produce sap every spring. Trees did not remember the crime. Weather did not adjust in response to human events. The cycles of nature remained unchanged, indifferent to the human systems built around them. In that sense, the most important lesson of the maple syrup heist is not about maple syrup at all. It is about the relationship between systems and the people who operate within them. Any system, no matter how well designed, ultimately depends on behavior. And behavior, unlike machinery, is not perfectly predictable. Trust is not a flaw in that design. It is a requirement. But trust without verification creates openings that can be exploited in ways that are difficult to anticipate until after the fact. When people think of major crimes, they often imagine chaos breaking through order, violence disrupting stability, sudden events that shock a system into awareness. This case unfolded differently. Order itself was used as cover. Routine became camouflage. Normality became protection. And that is why it remains one of the most distinctive thefts in modern criminal history. Not because of what was stolen, but because of how invisibility was achieved inside something so ordinary. In the end, the maple syrup heist does not leave behind a sense of spectacle. It leaves behind a quieter reflection. That even the most familiar systems can contain unseen gaps. That repetition can hide deviation. And that sometimes, the most extraordinary crimes are not the ones that break the system open, but the ones that move through it unnoticed until the absence becomes impossible to ignore. And when that absence is finally seen clearly, it is already too late to prevent the past from having happened exactly as it did. If you strip away the headlines, the numbers, and the courtroom language, what remains of the maple syrup heist is a story about visibility. Not visibility in the literal sense of cameras or surveillance systems, but the deeper kind of visibility that determines whether a system can recognize itself when something inside it changes. For a long time, nothing changed in a way that could be seen. Barrels left. Barrels returned. Records stayed balanced on paper. The warehouse continued to function exactly as it was designed to function. And that is precisely why the theft worked for as long as it did. Most people assume that large-scale crimes succeed because systems are weak. In reality, they often succeed because systems are strong in the wrong way. They are optimized for efficiency, not interruption. They are designed to reduce friction, not increase scrutiny. They are built to assume continuity. In Quebec's maple syrup reserve, continuity was not just an assumption. It was the entire operating principle. The idea that barrels would always be where they were supposed to be was not questioned daily. It was built into every process, every schedule, every movement of goods. Without that assumption, the system would have slowed to the point of collapse under constant verification. That is the paradox at the center of this case. A system cannot function without trust. But absolute trust creates space for exploitation. What happened between 2011 and 2012 was not a failure of a single checkpoint or a single person. It was the gradual alignment of opportunity, access, and predictability. The crime did not force its way into the system. It followed the paths that were already open. That distinction matters. Because it shifts the focus away from a moment of failure and toward a structure that allowed gradual deviation to accumulate unnoticed. By the time the discrepancy became visible, the loss was already complete in practical terms. Thousands of barrels had been removed, processed, and distributed. Even after investigation and recovery efforts, the system could not fully return to its previous state. What had been taken was not just inventory, but time, confidence, and certainty. In the aftermath, reforms were introduced. Monitoring increased. Tracking systems became more precise. Audits became more frequent and more detailed. But even those changes did not eliminate the core tension exposed by the case. The need to balance efficiency with oversight remained unchanged. Too much scrutiny would slow the industry. Too little would risk repetition. That balance is not unique to maple syrup. It exists in nearly every large-scale system that depends on movement, storage, and trust. Supply chains, financial networks, transportation systems, even digital infrastructure all operate on similar principles. They assume continuity until evidence suggests otherwise. The maple syrup heist simply made that assumption visible. There is a reason this case continues to be remembered long after the legal proceedings ended. It does not rely on shock value in the traditional sense. There is no violence to replay, no dramatic confrontation to revisit. Instead, it leaves behind a quieter discomfort. The realization that something so large could be removed so slowly without immediate detection. That discomfort is what makes it instructive. Because it forces a question that extends beyond the specifics of maple syrup, beyond Quebec, beyond even the individuals involved. It asks how many other systems operate on similar assumptions without realizing it. How many processes depend on repetition so consistent that deviation becomes invisible until it is too late? How often does normality itself become the perfect cover for abnormal activity? The answer is not specific to this case. It is structural. And that is why the story remains relevant. Not because it was unusual, but because it was possible. In the end, the maple syrup heist does not conclude with a dramatic twist or a final revelation that redefines everything that came before it. It ends in a quieter place. A courtroom decision. Institutional adjustments. Industry reflection. And a return to production, where trees continue to produce sap each spring regardless of what happened in the years before. The forests of Quebec did not change. The seasons did not change. What changed was awareness. A recognition that even in systems built on order, predictability can become a vulnerability when it replaces vigilance entirely. And so the story closes not with certainty, but with awareness of fragility. Because the real legacy of the maple syrup heist is not the syrup that was taken. It is the reminder that even the most stable systems are only as strong as their ability to notice when something inside them stops behaving as expected. And sometimes, that realization only arrives after the silence has already lasted too long to ignore. There is no official Part 11 in the structure you originally requested, because the story was designed to end at Part 9 with reflection and aftermath. Extending it further is possible, but it shifts away from the intended narrative arc of investigation, trial, and resolution. Still, there is one final layer worth exploring, not as an extension of events, but as a final perspective on what this case leaves behind when everything legal, financial, and procedural has already been said. When people first hear about the maple syrup heist, they often respond with a kind of disbelief that borders on amusement. The subject matter feels almost harmless compared to the brutality usually associated with true crime. There are no victims in the traditional sense, no physical violence, no immediate threat to human life. That initial reaction is understandable, but it fades quickly once the scale becomes clear. What remains is something more uncomfortable. The realization that modern systems of production and distribution are not only complex, but dependent on trust so deeply embedded that it becomes invisible. The maple syrup reserve was not unusual in its design. In fact, it reflected best practices in agricultural economics. It existed to stabilize supply, protect producers, and ensure market consistency. It was, in many ways, a success story of cooperative industry management. And yet, that very success created the conditions for exploitation. This is where the story becomes less about maple syrup and more about structure itself. Every system that handles large-scale goods eventually faces the same tension. It must be efficient enough to function at scale, but secure enough to prevent manipulation. Efficiency demands repetition, predictable movement, and reduced friction. Security demands scrutiny, interruption, and verification. These two needs are always in conflict, and no system resolves that conflict permanently. The maple syrup heist did not introduce a new vulnerability into the system. It revealed one that already existed but had never been stress-tested in that specific way. That distinction is important, because it means the crime was not an anomaly in an otherwise perfect structure. It was an exploitation of a structure that was already optimized for trust. After the case, reforms were implemented. Tracking systems became more precise. Oversight increased. Digital monitoring replaced some manual processes. These changes reduced certain risks, but they did not eliminate the underlying paradox. No matter how advanced a system becomes, it still relies on human participation at multiple levels. And wherever humans are involved, interpretation, assumption, and routine will always play a role. Routine is the silent foundation of large systems. It allows thousands of transactions to occur without constant re-evaluation. It is what makes global supply chains possible. It is also what allows small deviations to remain unnoticed until they accumulate into something significant. That is why this case continues to be studied. Not because it was uniquely sophisticated, but because it was structurally revealing. It shows how a system can be functioning correctly at every individual step while still failing to detect a gradual divergence from reality. Nothing had to break for the theft to occur. Nothing had to collapse. Everything continued to operate normally while something inside it changed slowly enough to avoid immediate detection. That is a difficult idea to accept, because it challenges the assumption that systems fail in obvious ways. In reality, many failures are quiet. They emerge not from breakdown, but from continuity. When the case is reduced to its essence, what happened in Quebec is not just a story about stolen syrup. It is a story about perception. About how easily perception can align with expectation, and how dangerous that alignment becomes when it replaces verification. The barrels in the warehouse did not change appearance when they were emptied. They did not announce that something had been removed. They did not behave differently. They remained visually identical to full barrels for a period of time. That sameness was not incidental. It was structural. It was what allowed the system to function efficiently in the first place. But it was also what allowed the theft to persist. In the end, the maple syrup heist leaves behind a lesson that is not tied to any one industry. It applies to any environment where scale depends on trust, and trust depends on repetition. It is a reminder that the most stable systems are not immune to exploitation, they are simply dependent on the assumption that deviation will be rare enough to notice. And when that assumption is wrong, the system does not always fail loudly. Sometimes it fails quietly, over time, in a way that only becomes visible when someone finally asks a simple question that had not been asked before. What if everything looks right, but something is missing anyway? That is where this story ultimately ends. Not with noise. Not with collapse. But with awareness that stability and vulnerability often live much closer together than they appear. There is a point where extending a story stops adding new facts and instead begins circling the meaning of what has already been said. The maple syrup heist has already passed that point in terms of narrative events. The theft happened, it was discovered, investigated, prosecuted, and judged. The system responded, adapted, and tightened. The barrels were counted, the gaps were measured, and the people responsible were held accountable within the legal framework that existed to address them. What remains after that is not action, but interpretation. And interpretation is where the story quietly shifts from being about crime to being about systems. When people revisit this case years later, what tends to stand out is not the identity of the individuals involved, nor even the exact mechanics of how the syrup was moved. Those details are important, but they are not what lingers. What lingers is the realization that the theft did not require extraordinary technology or dramatic infiltration. It required time, access, and the ability to operate inside a structure that was already functioning smoothly. That smoothness is important. Because smooth systems are rarely questioned. In most industries, efficiency is treated as a success metric. The fewer interruptions there are, the better the system is assumed to be working. Inventory moves without delay. Records align without friction. Goods flow from production to storage to distribution with minimal resistance. In that environment, attention naturally shifts away from verification and toward throughput. The maple syrup heist exposed the hidden cost of that mindset. Not because efficiency is inherently flawed, but because efficiency often assumes that deviation is unlikely enough to be negligible. When that assumption holds, systems become faster and more scalable. When it does not, the same structure that enables performance also enables concealment. One of the most unsettling aspects of this case is how ordinary the conditions were that allowed it to happen. There was no catastrophic failure of infrastructure. No collapse of oversight. No single moment where everything went wrong at once. Instead, there was continuity. The system continued to function as expected while something within it gradually diverged from expectation. That divergence was not immediately visible. It rarely is. Large systems do not fail in binary terms. They drift. Slowly. Incrementally. In ways that are often indistinguishable from normal variation until a threshold is crossed. By the time that threshold is reached, the accumulation is already complete. In this case, that accumulation took the form of thousands of barrels that were no longer where they were supposed to be, or no longer contained what they were supposed to contain. Yet for a long period, nothing in the day-to-day operation of the reserve required anyone to confront that reality directly. The system continued to behave as if everything was intact. That as if is where the entire case lives. Because systems do not experience reality. People do. And people rely on signals. When signals remain consistent, interpretation remains stable. When interpretation remains stable, action is delayed. Delay is often harmless in stable environments. But in environments where hidden change is occurring, delay becomes the space in which loss accumulates. By the time visibility returns, the gap between expectation and reality can already be significant. What the maple syrup heist ultimately demonstrates is not just that systems can be exploited, but that exploitation does not always announce itself through disruption. It can exist inside normality, using normality as its cover. The barrels in the warehouse did not need to look different to become part of the theft. They only needed to remain indistinguishable long enough for absence to accumulate unnoticed. This creates a difficult tension for any system built on scale. If every component must be constantly verified, the system slows and becomes inefficient. If verification is reduced, the system becomes more vulnerable to gradual deviation. There is no final resolution to this tension, only shifting balance depending on risk tolerance and design philosophy. After the case, adjustments were made. Monitoring increased. Tracking improved. Procedures became more detailed. But even those changes did not eliminate the underlying structure that made the theft possible in principle. They reduced certain blind spots, but they did not remove the fundamental dependence on trust and routine. That is because no large system can function without them. Trust is not optional in systems of scale. It is embedded in the assumption that processes behave consistently enough that constant verification is unnecessary. Routine is not a weakness in itself. It is what allows complexity to be manageable. Without routine, systems collapse under their own operational weight. The challenge is that the same qualities that make systems workable are also the qualities that can obscure small deviations over time. This is where the story stops being about maple syrup entirely. It becomes a general pattern. One that applies to logistics, finance, supply chains, data systems, and any environment where large volumes of units are processed through repeated, standardized actions. In all of these contexts, the greatest risk is rarely sudden failure. It is gradual divergence that remains below the threshold of detection long enough to matter. The maple syrup heist simply made that pattern visible in a way that was easier for people outside those systems to understand. Because syrup is familiar. Because barrels are tangible. Because the scale is easier to imagine than abstract financial flows or digital records. But underneath that familiarity lies a structure that is anything but simple. In the end, what this case leaves behind is not a dramatic conclusion, but a quiet recognition. That systems can function correctly at every individual step and still produce incorrect outcomes over time. That visibility is not guaranteed by scale or organization. And that stability is not the absence of change, but the continuous management of it. And once that is understood, the maple syrup heist is no longer just a strange crime story. It becomes a reminder that the difference between order and unnoticed disorder is often not a failure of design, but a failure of observation sustained over time.